trouble. Looks like we got everybody in. If I can get Ann to call the roll, just to see how if we got a quorum.
Thank you. Okay, Reed is here. Dr. Cantu, John Agather, Anakwa, Councilwoman Villagrán,
Here.
Peter, Andy Castillo, Al Rodriguez, Michael Kinnick.
Online.
Thank you. Anne Marie.
Online.
Thank you. Jack, Wayne, Tony Edwards, Michael Sanchez. He was not going to be able to join us. So, Dee Dee, Kurt.
Online.
Thank you. Christopher.
Online.
Dr. Femi.
Online.
Thank you. Dana. Okay. Jim.
Online.
Thank you. And Anita.
Also online.
Perfect. We have a quorum, sir, and then some.
Okay, thank you very much. I really appreciate everybody attending today. It's a very important meeting. Now we'll have the invocation. Mr. Reyes?
Let us pray. We thank you for the many blessings that you have freely given to each of us. And we ask for your presence to guide this meeting of the CPS Energy RAC. Provide them with the knowledge, compassion, and wise counsel needed as they discuss the business matters on the agenda today. Help us all to remember that we are stewards acting on behalf of our customers, and provide us with the grace to serve all people well. And we ask this in your name. Amen.
Thank you very much. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. One, Ann is prepared for us a binder so that we can keep all of this stuff together and not lose it. It's very important information. So I really appreciate all that getting done. Also, one of the suggestions we've had, and I think it's a good one from Dr. Cantu, is today we're more in a learning mode as opposed to a discussion mode. And so we're going to have specific times for questions in the Q&A. And so this time we're going to ask that people write their questions down. We were afraid that we were missing or not properly understanding the questions. So if you would, everybody has a yellow pad and a pen. Write your questions down. We'll collect them. And then we'll kind of sort them because there might be several of the same. If you are online, then I think we've made provisions that you can either use the chat or you can send an email with your questions to, okay? I think that's the way it worked out. I didn't hear right at the end. Okay, now let's just see, is there any citizens to be heard? Well, maybe I should call the individual's name. That's okay. Okay, all right, that's fine. Daniel, are you here? Okay, we're going to turn it over to Benny now, who will start introducing our program here with Charles Rivers.
Thank you, Reed. Good afternoon, folks. So I'm really excited. We've got data to share with you. So today, let me see if I can get us going. Okay, somebody's going to have to help me with this one. Okay, that work in progress. Okay, so I'm really excited to share with you. We got the first set of data for you to look at today. This is our base case for the 9 portfolios. Basically, as you'll recall, the base case is just an extension of what we're seeing today. Next month, we're going to have the balance of the scenarios for you to look at. But today we start with the base case. All we're doing is learning to review the data together today and talking through it. No decisions, no recommendations, just looking at this data and answering your questions. John Cossip and the team have met. They've got a good review put together for you. And so I'm going to turn it over to John to walk us through. There we go. This is today. I'm going to turn it over to John to walk us through this presentation, and we'll get the CRA team up here and present the data to you. So look forward to talking more about it. John?
All right, thank you, Benny. Good day, everyone. Just a brief recap of our last meeting in September. We covered a lot of ground there. We were in the inputs, assumptions, analysis process stage, right? Understanding that, asking questions. We achieved the final review of objectives and metrics, and we had some slight adjustments to that based on some feedback we received, and we'll talk about that coming up. The reason why we do those objectives and metrics, just to review briefly here, is to quantify the results or get to that scorecard. And that's really kind of a brief introduction of the preliminary scorecard we're going to see today, and start getting familiar with it as we move into that stage. So we reviewed results of the ERCOT market scenarios. To recall, those are the external market conditions. Those impact CPS Energy's generating portfolio. External conditions, and that's where we talked about the reference case that Benny mentioned, or the reference scenario. Also, carbon-based economy, net zero carbon emissions, volatile market. So there's 4 scenarios, 4 external conditions. We have the reference scenario today is what we'll be looking at. It'll be those the portfolios, the portfolio definition we went over last meeting. All right. We're good. All right. We're going to pause a bit and work on that. All right. We'll try that. All right. We're good. It's just a little flip of a switch there, and we're back. So, all right. Thank you over there, Thomas. So the portfolio definitions we went over, that's the portfolios are the new resources to be added, as well as the existing resources that are there, and there's a certain retirement profile for those existing resources. There's several sensitivities that are coming. We talked about those will be next time: the extreme weather, the Sustainable Tomorrow Energy Plan, or STEP, expanded and redesigned sensitivities for that. Build versus buy. So given all that, we're going to look at 9 results today, partial or preliminary. We'll eventually have up to 30 results to look at here for the next meeting. So in your packet today, we provided a questions and answer packet. We captured a lot of good feedback last time. And what we did was we captured 22 items that you'll see in there. It's really the first 5 pages are really the meat of that. There's another 54 pages of appendix that help support that, but really you can kind of work through those, take a look at them. We weren't intending on covering those in detail, but take a look. If you have additional comments, questions, let's cover that. We put them into 5 topic areas there, as you see on the screen. And there's a few more responses that we'll have in the upcoming deck that kind of address some questions or comments that were raised. And this slide, really, this was some of the feedback we received last meeting was, where are we in this kind of overall process? It's a lot to think about. We've got all the operational issues that we deal with hour to hour, 24/7. And we also have this long-range planning issue that we're dealing with here. So we're in this, 5 to 8 year space here in the long-range planning. We do, to kind of look at the longer range because of the implications with some of these long-lived assets. But that's where we want to focus, is in that 5 to 8 year range where we have, needs coming up. We do, have feedback mechanisms as we, our operational team will give us feedback on things they're seeing that, and some adjustments we can make with technologies that are out there. Also, we can, provide feedback to the operational folks on new technologies, new capabilities that we don't know or understand today to determine how that will, ultimately integrate. So that hopefully gets us, kind of an idea of where we're at and kind of the overall picture. And also, we brought this slide back, to kind of review. This was something that we presented in May of this year. But, this is really the overall need that's driving our need to do this generation plan update. The key items are we're a growing community. It shows about 100, we're forecasting about 115 megawatts per year growth at peak. And also some capacity retirements that we're seeing on the horizon here, as well as, assessing the status of our coal fleet per the request of our board through the February resolution. So, that call out box is really pointing to that region that we're focusing on too, in that 5 to 8 year time frame, where we've got the Summers gas steam units, 830 megawatts rolling off in that 27, 29 time frame, and then of course the coal units, those two, that's 1,345 megawatts. So overall, about 2,100 megawatts that we're assessing here in detail. So the bottom line is, new capacity is needed to meet our customer needs here. So, and that is all for me, and I will turn it now over to Pat Augustine with Charles River Associates, and we have Knight Sukthorn here to help us support that, and he'll go through the main part of the presentation.
All right. Thank you, John, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having us here again, and we'll look forward to talking through the preliminary results from the reference case, and really just an update on the status of the planning process, and that's where we'll start here on slide 8. This image we've been showing the last 3 or 4 meetings where CRA has presented to this group, and it's really just designed to orient the team here as to the 5-step process that we're working through and where we are in that process. Step 1, identifying planning objectives. As John just referenced, we introduced these originally in July. We got feedback in August and September, and we'll actually give a quick report on how we've adjusted some of those objectives in response to RAC member feedback over the last couple months. But we've talked about that being a very important upfront step. Before we get into the weeds of the analysis, we need to know what we want to measure and how we're going to measure it. Step 2 is developing those market scenarios. This was done during the July to September time period. So I think in your laminated handout, you've got a summary of those 4 market scenarios. They're external conditions that really set the stage for how CPS Energy will operate within the broader market. And that incorporates key drivers that are somewhat out of the utility's control: the price of natural gas, carbon regulation, the costs of new technologies, load growth, ERCOT policy. So you'll probably recall the September meeting, we spent a lot of time reviewing that. What are all those inputs and what are the outputs from the ERCOT simulation that create those market scenarios? Step 3, develop resource portfolios. We're going to spend quite a bit of time here today going into real detail on what those portfolios look like. In September, we laid out the 9 concepts at a high level. Those include different retirement dates for the various elements of the portfolio. And today we're going to go a level deeper and show you how the modeling simulation came out with new resource options according to all the different themes that we identified in those 9 concepts. So we'll spend quite a bit of time on step 3. Step 4 is the portfolio modeling and analysis. So we're right in the middle of that. Today will be the first time we report out on key results and key metrics. As you'll see, it's not a complete report out. We've got certain elements that are still under the in the works, and all the extra scenarios and sensitivities are going to come at a later point in the November meeting. And then, of course, step 5 is ultimately making that decision and using this information to try to select a preferred plan. So we'll do a quick recap here on the portfolio objectives and metrics, and just report back very quickly some of the small adjustments that we've made since the feedback that we received primarily in the August meeting and the September meeting. So we've made some final refinements. A lot of this should look familiar, but we've made a few tweaks to the overall objectives that we're measuring as we go through the analysis process. So just as a reminder, on the left-hand side here are planning objectives. These are the objectives that CPS Energy has as a going concern and a utility, and the things that are important to the group. You'll probably recall in August, there was that dot plot exercise where we kind of took the pulse of the group on which objectives are most important, and we've ordered these in that ordering. So system reliability was number one. We've added climate resiliency within that structure. There was some feedback in the last meeting that environmental sustainability is a little bit different than resiliency, and the resiliency and reliability concept might tie together more closely. So that's number one. Number two, environmental sustainability. We're very focused here on emissions, primarily CO2 emissions, also covering some energy efficiency components. And that's a slight tweak from last meeting as well, where we've taken that extreme weather risk associated with the climate resiliency theme, brought it into the reliability, and are focusing that environmental sustainability metric very much on the City of San Antonio's climate action and adaptation plan goals. So CO2 emissions and intensity are the main metric there. Number three, affordability. That is very much unchanged from last meeting, focused on bill impact and a term revenue requirements, essentially the amount of money that CPS Energy has to collect from customers in order to fund the operations. That is fuel costs, any emission costs, O&M costs, but also the capital investment that might be needed to develop or build resources, and power purchase agreements that may go into contracting for resources from other entities. So those were the top three objectives. We have two more. You may recall from the last meeting, we actually had a third on this secondary list, so a total of six associated with CPS financial stability. And there were several comments from the group about, shouldn't that be a minimum requirement? And shouldn't you be designing all the portfolios to meet your minimum needs to make sure that CPS Energy is financially stable? And I think there are some comments in the Q&A on that as well, and the team agreed with that. And we took it off of the objective list under the assumption here that all of the portfolios, as they're developed and as rates are collected, they would be done in a fashion to keep CPS Energy financially stable. And we're going to focus on the uncertainties and the trade-offs in other objectives. So that's a change from last meeting. We no longer have the CPS financial stability because that is essentially a given, or something that we have to make sure is preserved across all the alternatives that we're looking at. But we do have two additional objectives here: system flexibility and workforce impact. These metrics and measures are very similar to what we talked about in prior meetings. Flexibility is being measured through an assessment of how different portfolios will rely on the ERCOT market, as well as what the composition of those portfolios are from a dispatchability or controllable perspective. And the workforce impact is something where we'll take into an estimate of the number of CPS Energy generation fleet jobs that will go along with each of the portfolios that we're looking at, as well as a measure of local economic impact, proxied by the amount of investment of new resources to serve electricity needs that would be happening in the greater San Antonio area. So moving on to the portfolio definition. So that was a recap just on kind of the high-level objectives and metrics, and a couple tweaks that we've made since last meeting. And now we're going to get into a little bit more depth on the CPS Energy portfolios. So before we do that, just a reminder of some terminology here: scenarios versus portfolios. Scenarios are what we talked about primarily in the September meeting. So these are future states of the world, largely independent of CPS Energy resource decisions. So the price of natural gas, the cost of wind and solar, load growth. And we've developed those four scenarios and spent a lot of time reviewing them last meeting to kind of set the stage for the external environment under which CPS Energy will operate. Today, we're going to focus on the portfolios. And just as a reminder, portfolios are CPS Energy plans to meet customer requirements in the future. So that could include decisions on existing resource retirements, new resources being brought into the portfolio, and that could be supply and demand side resources such as energy efficiency, and ultimately include a portfolio composition of new resources over a long-term planning horizon. So to John's point earlier, we want to focus key decisions on that near-term 5 to 8 year horizon where certain needs have to be made. But as we do the analysis here, we're going to build out portfolio concepts across a longer-term horizon and get 9 distinct plans for how CPS Energy could alter and build out its portfolio of generation resources for the future. So in order to do that, we've got a whole series of modeling analyses that have been performed. This is a slide that we shared, at least in a somewhat modified form, over the last couple of meetings, and I won't get too deep into the modeling details, but the key points here are we've got themes that have been developed, and there's a tool. We use the Aurora Portfolio Optimization Tool. It's a common commercial grade software that's used in the industry to identify, under a series of constraints and inputs, what an optimal set of portfolio resources and decisions might be. What goes into that tool? On the left-hand side, all those scenario parameters that we talked about. So what's the price of natural gas? What are the potential carbon policies? What's the load growth looking like? And then all the cost and performance characteristics of new resource options. So we spent a fair bit of time, I think last meeting, going over those options at a high level. You'll note that there's a very detailed appendix in the handouts and in this document that documents that and has some follow-up to some of the questions that came out from the last meeting. So what are the costs of these resources on an installed basis? How many dollars per kilowatt of installed capacity do these options have? What are the costs if you want to look at that from a dollar per megawatt hour of energy produced basis? So there's different ways of looking at the overall cost, which we've documented in the appendix. But those costs include the capital that you have to either construct or contract for a new resource, as well as different operational parameters. So what's the efficiency, the heat rates of a gas unit, the O&M or operations and maintenance costs associated with operating that unit, and so on. So those are all kind of parameterized there on the left. And then several constraints that go into this. So ultimately, we're trying to find a least cost set of resource options, but we need to meet those modeling constraints at the bottom. And those 2 key constraints are having enough capacity to meet CPS Energy's peak capacity requirements plus a reserve margin. And secondly, meeting CPS Energy demand. So capacity and energy are related, but are 2 different concepts. Capacity is really focused on being able to serve peak needs at those peak hours during the year. And energy is a sum of all the hours and energy demand that is required over the year. And I think an important point to make here, which we document on the right, is different resource types provide different attributes for capacity and energy. And as the model is kind of doing its solving and working through the different options, those are both kept into account. And the build-outs that we'll talk about in a few minutes here try to meet those constraints with the different attributes associated with the key technology options on the left. So on the top right there, we talk about different resource options providing different contributions to CPS Energy's net peak. Thermal units generally are able to be fully available at peak up to their rating. There's a forced outage and some outage derates that generally go into this type of analysis. But if you have a gas plant or a coal plant or a nuclear plant, it's available generally around the clock and can be called upon to meet those capacity needs, whether that happens at 5 p.m. on a summer evening or 7 a.m. on a winter morning. And that's how you kind of look at what the capacity needs of those resources might be and how they contribute to CPS Energy's load. Other resource types are going to behave a little bit differently. So solar and wind are intermittent. You've got to line up the expected times on which those resources are available to produce, how that lines up to CPS Energy's peak, and that goes into their capacity value. Storage is an emerging technology that's likely to have a varying amount of capacity value over time as a lot changes in the market. The load shapes change, the hours of peak demand change. And it's important to point out some of those different D ratings that effectively go into this model. For example, solar has fairly good capacity credit from a system-wide perspective because the peaks tend to happen in the summer afternoons or early evenings when there's a lot of sun. But as the market evolves and as the amount of resources in a portfolio evolves, the net contribution or the contribution to the net peak for CPS Energy is going to decline over time. The reason for that is you need dispatchable resources to be available for all periods of time when loads will hit. And the net peak, the effective peak, when you net out resources that are not dispatchable, tends to move later and later in the evening. So we've got an appendix slide on this showing that the value of incremental solar over time to the market from a peak perspective is going to decline. So that's an element that has to get picked up in this type of analysis. The bottom right of this slide here shows some indicative numbers for energy contribution. So this kind of points to the utilization topic that's come up before. So just because you have a 100 megawatt facility doesn't mean that it's going to be producing 100 megawatts every hour for the system. Wind and solar are going to produce when they're available, when the natural resource is available. And from an annual capacity factor perspective, solar is generally going to have about a 28% capacity factor, meaning out of 100 megawatts available for the year, it's going to produce on average 28 megawatts. Wind is generally in the 40 megawatt or 40% range. And then your thermal resources are very dependent on fuel prices, market conditions, the efficiency of those resources, what the rest of the ERCOT market looks like, and they're dispatchable to those market prices. And then finally, storage is a unique resource that has an ability to take in energy and put it out at different times. So the behavior of that resource is, again, going to be dependent on market prices, the amount of duration you have in the storage. Is it a battery that can only last for 2 or 4 hours, or is it a longer term storage that can last for 10 to 20 hours? So very variable. The point here, I think, in summary, is just that different resource types have different attributes. And the goal of this type of analysis is to look at those different attributes, set minimum constraints to meet CPS Energy needs, and ultimately define the combination of resources that are going to do that. So what are the portfolios that we're looking at? This slide is one that we shared in September, and I think it's unchanged. These are the 9 concepts that the team has come up with. The 4 on the left are those that were offered from a retirement date perspective as CPS Energy planning concepts. And P5 to P9, the P just stands for portfolio, are those that were proposed by RAC member Belmaris. And those reflect a series of different retirement dates for different plants in the fleet and different technology that is allowed to come in when we do that optimization and resource selection analysis that I just talked about on the prior slide. So I don't want to go through line by line here, but you can take a look at the key decision points. Spruce 1 and Spruce 2, those are the coal units. You can see that we have different retirement dates or potential conversion to gas for Spruce 2 in particular. And then the rest of the units there are existing gas-fired assets. Arthur von Rosenberg and Rio Nogales are the combined cycles. And then the others are other more traditional peaking gas units, but those are all natural gas-fired units. There's a set of expected retirement dates, kind of the end of life of these assets. And then we have some variance on that based on other proposals that were made here. And then the blue row up at the top shows the allowed technology to meet the gaps that will evolve. So you might recall that we had different concepts focused on natural gas resource additions, focused on renewable resource additions, and then what we're characterizing as a blend. Effectively give the modeling simulation tool an option from all the different resources to see what a blend might look like, sampling from those different renewables, storage, and natural gas resources. So these are the concepts. We kind of set the stage with the retirement dates. We fix those in. We put all the inputs in, and we set those constraints and take a look at the type of resources that are likely to come out. The next couple slides summarize now in detail what these portfolio concepts look like. This is a busy slide. We're going to get to the next one that kind of graphically shows it, but we wanted to include it in here as a reference point. So you could take a look over the next 7 or 8 years or so. We've focused just between 2023 and 2030. This is the cumulative number of new megawatts by technology type in each of these 9 portfolio concepts. So I won't go line by line, but just want to call out a couple of important points. First of all, it's only through 2030. We've got another slide in a couple minutes here that shows some of the potential long-term additions. But this is the focus on the near term, the type of decisions that have to be made in the near term for new resource additions, and it's cumulative. It does include the Flex Power Bundle that CPS Energy is pursuing right now. So that's a 500 megawatt natural gas combined cycle tolling agreement, and quite a bit of solar energy, about 800 to 900 megawatts, and then a little bit of short duration storage. So that is all incorporated in here. And then above and beyond that, you'll see the additional resources that come into the different portfolios over this period of time. Final point, you'll see market purchases at the bottom. We talked a little bit about this last time. Certain retirement dates and conversion dates may result in a situation where there is not sufficient resource to procure, build, or contract for and bring it into CPS Energy's portfolio quick enough. So for example, it may take 3 or 4 years to permit and plan and build a natural gas-fired resource. So given where we are today, that type of resource may not be available until 2027. So there may have to be a short-term bridge-type market purchase that would come up. Similarly, if we retire a lot of coal and natural gas over the next 5 to 7 years, we may not be able to bring within the next 3 to 5 years or 5 to 7 years sufficient amounts of renewables and storage into that portfolio so rapidly, given development timelines, permitting and contracting. And as a result, we've built out a series of what we characterize here as market bridge purchases. So short-term ways to proxy, a way to kind of go to the market for some energy and capacity and allow time for those new resources to come online. So this graphic here on this slide, slide 17, is really just distilling that whole big table of numbers into a quick snapshot by 2030. So you'll notice there's no market purchases. Those were all just bridge type purchases to get us to 2030 when we assume that we can transform the portfolio in these different ways. And what you'll note here is this is the nameplate capacity of megawatts that are coming online in each of the 9 concepts. So the heights of the bars are different, and that's to be expected because primarily we have different retirement dates across the different portfolio options. And as I mentioned earlier, different resource types have different contributions to the system's net peak. So 1 megawatt of solar is not the same as 1 megawatt of wind or 1 megawatt of a natural gas plant. So there'll be different amounts of resource type to come in to meet the peak requirements based on the resource types that are eligible in these portfolios. For example, portfolio 4, that's kind of the shortest bar there. You'll probably recall that that portfolio retains both spruce units as coal-fired facilities through the rest of the decade and longer term. So if the coal units stay operational, as a result, you'll need less new capacity to meet the load growth and other needs of the utility going forward. Portfolios 6 and 7 are the highest bars because those portfolios have both spruce units retiring at the earliest dates, and they also have additional gas-fired retirements this decade than some of the other portfolios. So if you retire more capacity, additional capacity from new resources has to come online. Otherwise, some of the comments to the left, I think, point out some of the key observations. The Flex Power Bundle is included in here. So that new CC toll at the bottom is across all the portfolios. You'll see the gas conversion in the hatched blue, and then other new gas, either combined cycle and solid blue, or in that dashed line, RICE or reciprocating internal combustion engine. So that's Generally speaking, a smaller modular peaking unit, a little bit less efficient than a combined cycle. And that makes up the gas resources. Spruce 2 obviously converts to gas in portfolios 1, 2, 8, and 9, but it doesn't convert in the others, so that's why you'll see the conversion there. And then in portfolios that do not allow that new gas capacity, primarily portfolio 3 and then 5 to 9, you'll see primarily wind in green, solar in that yellow color, and then quite a bit of storage to meet the flexible dispatchable capacity needs in that burnt orange color. And then finally, we talked about this a little bit last meeting. There are emerging technologies that are likely to come into play towards the end of the decade and beyond. And we allow certain new technologies to be eligible in 2030 and beyond. That includes hydrogen. So you'll see hydrogen-enabled gas thermal capacity coming into many of these portfolios, and potential geothermal resource options, particularly in portfolios 6 and 7, where a lot of additional gas energy is retired and geothermal becomes a new option. So as we note in the note here, hydrogen is a technology that from an economic perspective looks potentially promising, particularly with the fairly generous subsidies that are now available through the Inflation Reduction Act. And given those assumptions that we put into it, it tends to be a technology that could potentially look good. So it's a 2030 type technology. It's not something that you'd be betting on necessarily, but from an economic perspective, looking at the opportunities, it's something that the modeling simulation tends to like. So wouldn't focus on that as being a major component, but from some of the emerging technologies, it's probably one that we'll start to track, along with geothermal, long duration storage, and some others. So I will say here, we're going to cover 2 more slides that show different views on the mix of the portfolio. In the appendix, there's a lot of detail for each of the 9 portfolios on the annual evolution of each of these resource additions. So this slide focuses on the total additions. We're going to have a slide that shows the capacity, supply-demand balance, and then a third slide that shows the energy mix. So capacity is ability to meet that peak. Energy is just the number of megawatt hours that are churned out over the course of the year to meet your energy demand. And we're going to try to summarize that all by 2030 to give a few snapshots. In the appendix, for each of the 9 portfolios, there's 3 slides. One that shows this type of view year by year, what is coming into the portfolio. One that shows kind of the supply-demand balance from a capacity perspective, and one that shows the energy mix over time. So feel free to review those as additional detail, but we're trying to keep the summary here at a high level through 2030, which is, as we talked about, a key benchmark point. So this slide shows that capacity supply-demand balance perspective, and we're now going to include existing capacity. So the prior slides were focused on what are the new resources that we're going to come in to the portfolio after we go through that retirement exercise. This is now stepping back and saying, okay, in 2030, as we evolve the fleet, we retire coal, we retire some gas, we bring this new capacity in, how do we look in terms of the resources that we have to meet our peak relative to our expected peak demand, which, as John outlined on an earlier slide, is likely to be around 6,000 megawatts in a few years. And you want a reserve margin above and beyond that to cover uncertainties, whether that's hotter or colder than expected, plants that go out, uncertainty in how wind and solar is operating. So this is doing that for each of the 9 portfolios. You can see at the bottom, nuclear, that's the South Texas nuclear plant where CPS Energy has 1,000 megawatts or so of capacity. So that's part of the existing fleet. In blue, you'll see a lot of gas. It varies depending on how much gas was retained in the system or added according to the different portfolios. So P1, P2, P4, you'll see a substantial amount of gas because it's either staying in the mix or was added as per the theme. And then you'll see wind, solar, storage, and hydrogen representing much of the rest here across the board. P6 and P7 retires a lot of gas. It brings in a lot of renewables and storage. As I mentioned before, you'll kind of see a small slice for solar. So by 2030, the expectation is the capacity credit, the contribution of solar energy to what will likely be CPS Energy's net peak in the 8 p.m., 9 p.m. hour on a summer day is much lower than its nameplate capacity. This is an issue that a lot of markets across the country are now starting to tackle and think about, and that's particularly the case with solar resources. So it provides a lot of good energy to the portfolio, but from a capacity planning perspective, it has a small slice because the net contribution to CPS Energy's net peak at 8 or 9 p.m. is small because there isn't expected to be a lot of solar energy. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And that solar accreditation is very dynamic. This is a view of what it would likely look like in 2030. And then this slide here shows the annual net energy contribution. So same set of resources, but instead of that capacity available during your peak hour view, this is the amount of energy that can be produced by this portfolio relative to the amount of energy that CPS Energy customers will demand. The units are different, so we had kind of a view on megawatts before. Now we've translated to a megawatt hour or a terawatt hour, just a million megawatt hour type view. And what we have here is a slightly different mix. Again, you'll see nuclear on the bottom. You'll see a lot of blue in natural gas, a little bit of geothermal in some of the renewable portfolios, and then wind and solar in green and yellow respectively. So although solar may not have a lot of contribution to peak across these different portfolios, it's still representing a fairly significant contribution to the total energy. So a few things to point out. Portfolio 2 is about 50% gas, a little more than 50% gas and 50% clean, a quarter from nuclear, about a quarter from renewables. Whereas portfolios 6 and 7, for example, would be 80% clean, a little bit of gas left over, but primarily nuclear and renewables. And then portfolio 3 in the middle there has about a third from gas and then 2/3 from clean energy, or at least CO2 emitting clean energy. Portfolio 1 obviously has the most gas, and portfolio 4, you'll see the coal units sticking around, and that gray box there represents the coal. So I think those prior 3 slides are really the best way we can try to summarize what the portfolio mixes look like at various points in time, to give you a sense of the different trade-offs here between existing coal, gas, renewables, and storage. So I don't want to spend too much time on the long term, but we wanted to just give you a high-level view of the type of technologies that are coming into these mixes over time. And this is an illustrative view. Again, the appendix material has a lot of detail. But the point that we want to make here is between 2023 and 2029, we've got a fairly narrow list of established technologies, different natural gas options, wind, solar, and short duration storage. In 2030 and beyond, there's opportunities to pick up longer duration storage, could be different technology types, geothermal resources, potentially hydrogen, and potentially some other technologies. This table here shows the cumulative capacity additions between 2031 and 2047. I'll point out this is, as of today, the information we know, the economic analysis, the costs, the expectations for future commodity prices. This is generally the type of mix of resources that an optimization model is producing. But it's highly dependent on technology change, policy change, and we'll kind of use this as an indicative long-term view, but by no means are we designing these portfolios where you would be locking in to X amount of geothermal or hydrogen or storage over time. But from a high level, we see lots more renewable energy coming into all the portfolios across time, and primarily long duration storage and hydrogen-based technology being the dispatchable resource types. If technology improvements or cost declines happened in the nuclear energy space, we might see a different view if we were to rerun this analysis 5 or 10 years from now. Geothermal or other technology in that space could evolve. So just want to show this as a detailed illustration of what we're producing in this analysis, but make the emphasis here that we're not locking in any long-term technologies because those are certainly highly uncertain. Final slide in this section, I think, is the other side of the laminated sheet that you've got, and is intended to be a nice little legend or cheat sheet as we go forward and talk about some of the quantitative results. These are the 9 portfolios in kind of a simple, distilled way of looking at their distinctions. So we've got the allowed technologies, the action on the existing fleet, largely focused on spruce, but also some of the other gas technologies. And then a quick snapshot in pie chart form of the generation mix, the energy contribution in 2030. So again, the appendix details get into a lot more annual and capacity and generation-based views. But we'll just close this section out by effectively giving a snapshot of what these 9 portfolios are, and certainly keep this as a nice reference slide as we go forward into the final section of the presentation here. So slide 24 here is a graphic that we presented back in September, and it's an illustration of the analysis that is getting done. So illustratively, we've got these 9 portfolios that we've now built out in a lot of detail. We have year-by-year retirements, year-by-year additions, year-by-year expectations about how much energy is going to be produced. And then we evaluate each of these 9 portfolios against all the external conditions. So that includes our reference case, so our base case for fuel prices and technology costs and carbon policy and load growth. And that it includes those 3 other scenarios, which is on the other side of that laminated sheet, the carbon-based economy scenario, the net zero economy scenario, and the volatile market scenario. So those are different scenarios that have different assumptions for all those inputs, different gas prices, different carbon policy, different technology costs for wind and solar and storage, different load growth. We had the question last meeting about electrification of electric vehicles and other technologies. That'll show up in the net zero scenario. So we're holding the portfolios constant. We're saying if you make these decisions on the portfolios, this is where they will evolve. And then we're going to subject the portfolios to each of those different scenario inputs. In addition to those 4 core scenarios, we've got the extreme weather sensitivity. So that has come up in comments the last couple meetings, where we're going to simulate what the portfolios will look like if we have an extreme weather event like Winter Storm Uri, or a very hot summer where we've got a couple months of above average temperatures, and take a look at how they perform. And then over to the right, we've got a few more sensitivities around the step, and potentially looking at building versus buying, whether CPS Energy could own resources, primarily renewables, versus contracting for them through power purchase agreements. So today we're really focused on the reference scenario. The other analyses are in process, but what we'll do is step through some of the key outputs from that reference analysis. Very briefly, this is a flow chart that we presented, I think, the last couple meetings on how all this analysis gets done. We presented in September all the ERCOT market scenario development. So from a macro level, we've got to look at the surrounding market. What are the fuel prices, the emission policies, et cetera, all of the variables we've been talking about, to come up with a view on the ERCOT market system and energy prices that will drive that market. Over on the right-hand side, today's focus is now diving a layer deeper into CPS Energy's portfolio. So we've got these 9 concepts that we've just developed. So on top of the macro ERCOT view, how do each of these portfolios perform on all the metrics that we talked about at the very beginning? So how are the plants operating? How many emissions are being produced by these portfolio options? We'll eventually talk about costs. We'll talk about market sales and purchases and the exposure of the different portfolios to each of those conditions that will come through this analysis. We'll start with the reference case today and then go through some of these other scenarios and sensitivities. So the next couple slides will show a couple examples of those gray circles over to the right, key outputs that come out of the market simulation. Then we'll walk through where we are on the scorecard and how that looks, and then take a break and open it up for questions. So first metric is reserve margin. We talked about this as being a constraint, and don't want to spend a whole lot of time here, but want to make the main point that as this model simulation is done, each of the 9 portfolios is designed to meet what is known as a planning reserve margin in the ERCOT market for CPS Energy. We look at expected peak load, we need a margin above that, and we look at the accreditation of all the resource types. The target is 13.75%. That's guidance that ERCOT gives. It's also CPS Energy's internal reserve margin target. And generally, you'll see all these portfolio options hovering right around that target. A few outliers, you can see P6 and 7 has the earliest retirement of the spruce unit. And we talked about those market bridge purchases being necessary because you may not be able to get new resources in prior to 2025, 2026 to replace some of that retired capacity. On the upside, P2, you can see a bit of a spike and then a fall back down. That's just due to some timing on when a new combined cycle natural gas facility comes into the portfolio, followed by retirement of the spruce, one of the spruce coal units. Otherwise, tend to see some bouncing around between about 13 and 15%, trying to meet that 13.75% target. Second key output is CO2 emissions. So this is big in the environmental sustainability objective. This is reported here as a portfolio emission intensity of the electric generating fleet. The axis here is pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour produced. And you can see where the current portfolio sits, somewhere around 1,000 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour. That's going to vary depending on the dispatch of certain units, but in that general ballpark, current fleet, it's got some coal still in it. It has some natural gas units in it. And then over time, all the portfolios are expected to have some decline over time as coal units and later gas units exit the portfolio. But the rate of that decline and the timing of that decline is going to vary. So on the high end, you can see the yellow dashed line representing P4. That's the portfolio that keeps the spruce units running on coal. So although it declines over time due to some other unit retirements and the fact that as the market evolves, we expect coal units just to run less over time, but it's the highest from an emission intensity perspective, at least through 2032 or so. On the flip side, you can see in the lighter blue colors, P7, P8, having early retirements of the spruce units or early conversions of those units, and no new gas-fired capacity being added to the portfolios. Those resources are going to see the quickest decline in CO2 emission rates. And in the middle, you've got a combination of different portfolios that have different levels of natural gas, different levels of renewables, and as a result, you'll see different trajectories over time. When we get to the scorecard, we're going to focus in on the 2030 as a benchmark here, but this gives you a sense for how the annual trajectories look. And then final slide before we get to the scorecard is kind of that local economic impact metric, particularly capital expenditures for new generation capacity built in the San Antonio area. So this is a metric where we're going to look at how much new capacity is built locally and what the economic impact might be by how many dollars of investment would be in the local economy due to those new resources. In this case, you'll see P6 and P7 have the highest, at least over the 2023 to 2030 period, largely driven by some local storage resources, but also potential for geothermal resources to replace some of the existing gas capacity. So you'll recall that portfolio has the most turnover of existing capacity and some potential for investment in new stuff. P1, P2, P4 tend to be the next set of resources, largely driven by the fact that those are adding natural gas capacity resources and thus would be built likely in the local region. Some of the others are a little bit behind under the assumption that not all of the wind and solar, and in fact, most of the wind and solar that would be procured or contracted or owned wouldn't be in the proximate area. It would be where the wind and solar resources and the land is available to build those type of infrastructure projects, and hence wouldn't qualify here for local resource investment. So those are some examples of the type of outputs that come from the model simulation. Again, in the appendix, there's a little bit more detail. But to close out the core discussion today, we just want to step through the scorecard. So we've talked about this quite a bit, and this is the first time I think where we're showing how it looks and how the reports will ultimately come out across the 9 portfolios. This is illustrative at a high level. We're going to take a few minutes just to go through each of the categories to show how they look and what the different trade-offs are. And as you'll note, some of this is work in progress. So any elements associated with the bill impacts and all the sensitivities and scenarios are still to be completed. We'll talk about a little bit later. There'll be an interim deliverable, I think, over the next couple weeks here that will show the reference case bill impacts. And then in the November meeting, we'll be able to populate some of the other metrics that go into the scenario analysis and those sensitivities, including the extreme weather sensitivity, which has a significant place here in this scorecard. But overall, the idea here is to put a lot of the outputs and data that comes from this analysis into a central scorecard or view that can help facilitate decision-making. There isn't one score that comes out of this because we've got a diverse set of metrics. We've got a diverse set of opinions on how to rank each of these objectives, but it gives a sense of the trade-offs, and that's really the purpose here, to try to aid in the decision-making. This process does not spit out a single right answer. It shows a series of trade-offs across the key metrics and objectives the group has identified and that we've evaluated here in the analysis. So if we go a little bit deeper and zoom in here, these are the first three objectives that were ranked by the group a couple meetings ago. System reliability and climate resiliency on the left. We've got environmental sustainability in the middle, then affordability over to the right. And as I mentioned, the gray boxes are work in progress that's coming later. From a coloring perspective, we've tried to take a neutral color and simply shade from darker to lighter to indicate what is more favorable. So the lighter shading represents an outcome that is more favorable than the darker shading for each of the metrics. So again, there's not a composite score, but within each column, generally speaking, the lighter color shading is representing something that's more positive, and the darker shading is more negative. These are the top three objectives, and this slide here shows the secondary objectives from system flexibility and workforce impact. So let's just walk through each of the categories before we pause and open it up to comments and questions. System reliability and climate resiliency, we've got two metrics that are reported, and then we've got two others that are pending. So the extreme weather sensitivity is going to produce some additional metrics that will go into this part of the scorecard where we'll measure the revenue requirement or the cost impact and the exposure to the market. But before we get to that, we've got two metrics that are populated. Number one, generation mix. So we talked about reporting out the diversity of the generation mix. This is a proxy for system reliable supply. You've got coverage against uncertainty in any single fuel source. And generally speaking, from a high level, the more diverse the portfolio, the better it would score on this particular metric. So P8 and P9 have the most diverse mix, and we're looking at the same 2030 pie chart that's in the laminated handout. P2, P4, P6, P7 generally have fairly diverse mixes and different levels of gas or renewables, and then P1 tends to have the least diverse mix. It retires the coal, and instead of having a diverse set of new resources, is very focused on new natural gas. So as a result, that from this scoring mechanism is less favorable. Second metric here is the reserve margin. So we talked about the target. We're generally going to be hovering in the 13 to 15% range. All portfolios are in that range, but there's a little bit of differentiation, particularly portfolios 6 and 7 having the lowest reserve margin for a couple of reasons. First of all, it may be difficult to bring the necessary capacity online to these portfolios given the retirements of the coal fleet and several gas plants as well. In addition, there's some uncertainty on what the capacity accreditation of new storage resources will be. So these two portfolios rely heavily on new storage, and as an emerging technology, depending on the duration of the storage, depending on how the market evolves, it's unclear how that resource will meet, from a capacity planning perspective, the reserve margin. So not a severe violation, but a lower potential outcome as we look at the 2030 time period. Second category, environmental sustainability. So we're largely focused here on the 2030 time period because, as I mentioned, A lot can happen between 2031 and 2040 with new technologies, potential retrofits to existing technologies. But we have reported emission intensity in 2040. But the metric has emission intensity reduction relative to 2016 by 2030. Again, this is under the reference scenario, as well as the emission intensity itself. So by 2030, P2, P6, P7, P8, P9 all achieve the cap target of about a 41% emission reduction, which implies about 540 pounds per megawatt hour. P1 and P4 do not meet that target. So if you were to retain the two spruce coal units and burn coal at them for the next decade, that would not achieve the emission reduction target. Similarly, if you were to replace those units with only natural gas resources, that would also not achieve the emission reduction target. And you can see in P1, you've got the darker shading in all those columns. The final column is percent reduction in demand due to energy efficiency. So this is all the same. We're going to get to those step sensitivities a little bit later. But each of the portfolios here that we're talking about have the same amount of energy efficiency, at least within the reference case view. All right, next metric is system flexibility. So as we mentioned before, we're focused on two metrics. System flexibility is the objective. Within that objective, we're focused on two metrics, market purchases and dispatchability. So market purchases is effectively the degree on which the portfolio would rely on ERCOT. So as part of an integrated system, CPS Energy is constantly buying and selling to and from the market. And that's a natural thing. It's not as if we're planning on an island. But we do want to track the amount of time or the percentage of the energy needs that are being met by each of these portfolios that is picked up by a market purchase. So in some hours you might be purchasing, but some hours you might be selling. But the metric here is really focused on the percentage of CPS Energy demand met by market purchases. You'll see that P1, P2, P4, and P9 are all below 10%. So generally, those portfolios have a lot of dispatchable capacity, natural gas across the board, at least in P1, P2, P4, new resources, and a lot of storage in P9. And then P6 and P7 are kind of on the other end of the equation there, where those resources have the greatest reliance on market purchases, retires all the coal in the system, retires a fair bit of natural gas units by 2030, so incremental gas retirements over the next 7 years or so, and increased deployment of intermittent resources. So while on average, the energy contribution of those portfolios is very similar to all the other portfolios, there are more hours during the year when CPS Energy's load would have to be met by market purchases. So it's as high as 18% in those two portfolios. And then dispatchability is the second metric here, effectively the degree to which CPS Energy controls generation output. So a wind resource, a solar resource is not dispatchable. Those resources produce energy when the wind is blowing, when the sun is shining. Other resource types, whether it be storage, a battery resource, a natural gas resource, a coal resource, those are dispatchable units where CPS Energy is able to call upon those units on demand. When there is a need for them to operate at a higher or lower level, they can be flexible, they can be dispatchable. Again, P1, P2, and P4 have the highest share of capacity that is dispatchable. So again, we're looking at 2030, look at the total capacity mix, look at the percentage that has that attribute, and those resources or those portfolios tend to have about 60% of the portfolio being dispatchable. And then on the flip side, P6 and P7 tend to be closer to 40%. So those, as I mentioned before, get rid of existing gas and coal capacity and replace it with some storage, some hydrogen. Those are resources that could be dispatchable, but also with a lot of wind and solar, which are valuable from an energy perspective, but not from a dispatchability perspective. And then final set of objectives here are the workforce impact. So the workforce impact is being proxied by the estimated number of CPS Energy generation fleet jobs, and then the local economic impact metric that I referenced a little bit before. So I'll start off by saying the number of CPS Energy jobs here is an estimate. It's not a precise accounting of specific headcounts at any plant, but in working with the CPS Energy plant teams and generation team, we've come up with a series of potential headcount estimates for the employees that would be employed at CPS Energy generation facilities. So not other parts of the business, just the generation facilities that CPS Energy owns. P1, P2, P4 have the highest headcounts. The coal facilities have the highest employee headcounts. And those portfolios that add gas resources allow CPS Energy to potentially redeploy employees into those units that require that labor force. P3, P5, P6, P7 tend to have the lowest because they are retiring the most existing capacity. And the new resources that are built either have fewer employee needs or they could be acquired through a power purchase agreement where CPS Energy is simply buying power from another provider. And then finally, capital expenditures for new generation capacity built in the greater San Antonio area. Mentioned this before with that bar chart that we talked about. P6 and P7 actually have the highest capital expenditures in the local area, driven largely by new geothermal resource opportunities that would be needed as a renewable resource to replace the coal and the gas that's retired, whereas P5, P8, P9 that might rely more on remote renewables would have less investment in the local economy. And then in the middle, you've got P1, P2. Those are resource portfolios that have additional gas capacity that would be built locally. So I think we're right about at time on the agenda. This covers the core material here in the scorecard. So I'll take a pause here to see if we want to open it up to questions or comments or take a break.
Say, Adrian, are we in adjournment? Yes?
We're on a break.
Okay, until when, Ann?
I don't know, probably 10 minutes or so. I don't
Okay.
know when it started to give you that time.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Hey, Jim. Yes, sir. We're on a break right now. Thank you, Anne Marie. We'll be back right shortly.
Okay, let's get started again. Hello.
We're here.
Everybody?
I'm here.
We're here. All right, I'm going to ask Charles Rivers to come back up and we're going to get through these questions. I'm going to read them. I'm going to read them the best I can. But if I misread one or can't read one, I'm actually going to call on that individual to ask their questions orally. Got to use this. Okay, I'll just start with Peter since it's on top. Pat, you said 24, decide on market purchases likely to be renewables. Why purchase renewables in scenario referenced? Peter, talk a little more about that. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, Pat, it was actually when you were going through slide, I think it's 24. So we go to slide 24. You made a reference as you were discussing the scenarios. If we can pull up 24. And I just wanted to understand, interpreting what you had said about purchasing renewables in that scenario. And I just didn't understand how that was tied to that particular slide, when I know later you went on to address different scenarios and the modeling.
Okay, yeah, I think that was referring to the build versus buy sensitivity here on slide 24.
Yes, right there where you addressed step, coming out of step, and I just didn't see the connection.
Yeah, so the idea there is that historically CPS Energy has purchased nearly all of its renewable energy through purchase power agreements, whereas it owns or has ownership share in nuclear, coal, and gas. But we may want to look at any differences that may result in the outcomes here if CPS Energy were to own or build its own renewables versus buying those renewables. So that's the idea there. And I think I mentioned with the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, there's now a provision for a municipal utility to get direct payment of the subsidies that go along with renewable, clean energy, and storage tax credits. So historically, you had to be a federal tax-paying entity to get those tax credits. That's no longer the case. So this is a little bit in the details of, nuanced procurement strategy, if you will. So not necessarily the macro view on what the portfolios look like, but are there differences in CPS Energy continuing to contract or buy through power purchase agreements renewable energy, or is there an opportunity maybe to own more of that? So that's what the build versus buy sensitivity is intended to look at.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Thanks for the clarification.
Yeah, one other point, John, is just making that this could apply to the gas resources too. So I may have focused on renewables with that example, but for example, on the other side, CPS Energy historically has owned natural gas resources, but there could be an opportunity to contract for them, perhaps under shorter term arrangements, such as the gas toll that was part of the Flex Power Bundle. So in general, there's just a lot of procurement flexibility that could be out there, and we might want to look at building versus buying in both directions. So I think that's a bit of an open-ended question, but something to think about as we go forward.
So just to clarify that, so you're saying when you reference renewables, it was based on the Inflation Reduction Act being a benefit, but it could be natural gas as a purchase agreement.
Correct. The Inflation Reduction Act has a new provision that allows a municipal utility that's not a federal taxpayer to get federal tax subsidies. That wasn't available in the past. So it made no sense for CPS to own its own renewables when someone else could own the renewables, get the subsidies, and pass that through as a contract. So that's the reason why this might be interesting for renewables. But yes, on the flip side, there may be other reasons to not own all the gas either. You might want to contract for part of it if you can get a flexible contract. So a little bit of a distinction, but it could work both ways.
And the modeling will show us, of course, where we have too much renewable resources, whether we're buying them or creating them, producing them.
Yeah, from an energy perspective, I mean, I think the different portfolios are going to have different ranges of renewables, and that's where it kind of comes out in the costs and the scorecard.
This next question has to do with when the portfolios were developed, is under ERCOT's current situation of not being connected to other grids, was that considered to be continued not to be connected or ultimately being connected to other grids?
Considered as the current state of affairs. So the ERCOT market has been evaluated as effectively a standalone grid. It's not connected to the Eastern Interconnect or the Western Interconnect. So all the scenario discussions we talked about last month were very focused on simulating that ERCOT market unconnected as its own grid. As we move forward with some of the sensitivities, including the extreme weather case, that may be an area where we'll see more volatility as a result of ERCOT being its own grid, but we're modeling under current state of affairs.
Those that write and print very well get read first. Slide 19, why is storage shown in the negative below the zero line?
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. I don't think I mentioned that. Both storage and hydrogen are shown as net negative contributors to energy because they are less than 100% efficient. So we'll start with storage first. So a battery draws energy from the grid at a certain time and then will release it back to the system at another time. And you're going to want to draw when prices are low or when there's a lot of renewable output, and then discharge back to the system when prices are higher or your load is higher. But that is not 100% efficient. So usually lithium ion batteries maybe about 85% efficient. So for every 100 megawatt hours that you take from the grid, you only have 85 to give back to the grid. So from a net energy perspective, that's why it's below the zero line. It's actually a net negative energy contributor. It can still have value because you're taking energy when it's less valuable and bringing it back to serve customers when it's more valuable. But in aggregate, that's why it's negative. Hydrogen has a similar situation. Now, you can look at hydrogen from different perspectives. The way we've been evaluating it is effectively through what's known as electrolysis. It's a clean, green hydrogen production method where you take electricity, you run it through an electrolyzer, you get hydrogen, you then burn that hydrogen in a turbine or an engine and produce energy when it's needed. Again, that's not 100% efficient. So same idea here. You might be taking electricity at a certain point in time, converting it into hydrogen that you can then store and burn at a more attractive time. So storage technologies are all about shifting energy, but from a net perspective, you have to consider the electricity that gets consumed to produce that storage resource.
Okay, slide 27. Because lower emission is based on renewables, would this be the most unreliable technology or non-dispatchable? That's the end of that one. Then it says possible response, refer to slide 24. But let's just answer the question.
Well, I think this comes to the scorecard trade-offs that we've started to look at. So the portfolios that go very low or close to zero on CO2 emissions are going to be those that have no fossil resources left in them. And those portfolios, 6 and 7 in particular, if you recall from the scorecard, they performed comparatively worse on the dispatchability and maybe some of the other flexibility or reliability metrics. So those are the trade-offs that we're looking for. There are certain clean energy resources that can also be dispatchable, including storage. But if you're relying heavily on wind and solar, you're going to have trade-offs on some of the other metrics.
This is similar to the other question on hydrogen. Just need some, hydrogen requires fossil fuels in its production and a lot of water. How is this process defined as renewable?
Yeah, hydrogen can be produced in multiple different ways. Some of the mechanisms involve fossil fuels, including natural gas. Others do not, although they do involve water, to the question's point. So green electrolysis is the expected type of hydrogen production that we're modeling. That does involve water, but it's splitting water effectively into its elements, including hydrogen, through electricity. So there's no fossil fuel that goes into that, particularly if the electricity is non-emitting. So that's what we're evaluating. I also mentioned, I think in a prior slide, that through the Inflation Reduction Act, this is now heavily subsidized up to the equivalent of about $20 per million BTU of potential subsidy for green hydrogen production. So that's why it's potentially economic. It's a 2030 and beyond type resource, so not a big share of these portfolios. But given expectations for the technology and the tax credits that are out there, that's why this is a potential technology to look at.
Okay, next question. Also, is there a plan in place with water scarcity? Can gray water be used in place of clean water? I'm not sure which application that's referring to, but I'll just leave that question up here.
Yeah, if that's referring to hydrogen production, then yes, I think that could be an opportunity. And it's a good point about water supply. You do need some supply of water to produce green hydrogen. And again, from an implementation perspective of any future plan, that has to be spec'd out, where the supply is coming from, where the hydrogen is being produced, how it may be getting transported. So I think there's a lot of uncertainties there, and that's kind of why this is a 2030 and beyond technology. But there are definitely opportunities to do that without fossil fuels and with different water supplies.
This is a general question on geothermal. Geothermal generates a lot of waste and requires proper management. It is known to have high upfront cost and can even cause earthquakes. Does CPS Energy know the location or future geothermal projects? So I assume that's site of future geothermal projects.
Yeah, just on the cost side, agree. It's got high upfront costs. That's been incorporated here. But once the upfront capital is invested, there's no fuel, and it's potentially clean energy. So that, from an economic perspective, is why it's showing up in a few of the portfolios. Maybe Benny can comment further.
Yeah, so geothermal energy, we're in the process of hiring 2 consultants to help us assess the opportunities we've got here in South Texas. When you look at maps, there's opportunities there. The earthquakes and such you talk about generally result from cases where you extract groundwater and then you re-inject it at another location. That's one type of geothermal energy. There's other companies that have developed closed loop systems in which you circulate the same water through the loop. Not thinking that's going to have that same issue, but we're just starting to study that. These contractors are coming on board. I'll tell you, we'll have information on that, but it's a little ways off.
Okay, this is a general question on climate resiliency. When you say climate resiliency, what do you mean by that? What does Charles River mean in this context? The climate justice community has a detailed and specific meaning to this term. How far does CPS Energy definition go? How far does, okay.
Yeah, I think it's focused on the generation portfolio. There was some discussion and commentary in the September meeting where there was a recommendation to take climate resiliency out of the environmental sustainability category because it doesn't really relate to CO2 emissions or generation-related environmental impacts directly from the generation, and bring it back into maybe the reliability regime. So from this perspective, we're really focused on the extreme weather exposure for the portfolio. I think there's a lot of other terms or components of climate resiliency that aren't picked up in this kind of study, which is focused on the generation mix and the ability of a generation portfolio to meet the needs of the customers. So we're trying to proxy that in more of a reliability, resiliency, weather exposure perspective. I believe there's other elements that may not be picked up in here, but this focus is generation based. And if there's further comments or details on that that you want to share, I think the team would take that into account.
Okay, this is a financial question. How much debt can CPS Energy float through additional bonds and still maintain its current credit rating? We better have somebody. Well, here comes our head accountant. Let's see. Financial officer right here. Does it all.
Yeah, so at any given time, we can issue up to $6.5 billion worth of debt. Again, our debt to equity ratios or equity to debt ratio is about 60-40, which is typical of the utility industry. And so when you're looking at $11 billion worth of assets, we typically tend to have about $6.5 billion worth of debt capacity. So any plans for the future would you either get money two places. You go to the ratepayer. So, there's a lot of tools we have. We've used one, the regulatory asset on the $400 million fuel charge that we paid as a result of Uri. So you could use regulatory assets or some type of adjustment of that nature to raise money on the equity side. Equity comes from ratepayers. You can pay it that way, or you can go to the markets and issue debt. And we typically use a combination of both. But we have about $6.5 billion worth of debt capacity.
And I don't know if you caught it or who this question's from when Pat was talking about it. We've taken those financial metrics and instead of running running tally on those and how we're doing, those in the model are constraints, so you can't violate them. And this isn't a optimizing model and has constraints, right? So the financials, they're lying on them right there. It's constrained. Okay. Next one is, what is the safe ratio between dispatchable, and I assume that means wind and or solar, and non-dispatchable, dispatchable natural gas versus non-dispatchable generation? In other words, if you've got a portfolio, does your model have some ratio in it between how much dispatchable you need in relationship to non-dispatchable?
Yeah, it's a tough question to answer specifically because I don't know that there's a single safe ratio. This is a hot topic in the industry. The ISOs, whether it's ERCOT or others, are studying it. There's a lot of risks that are being evaluated. What I can say is we've tried to incorporate the accreditation at peak, which is one proxy to get there. So the reason why solar, for example, is not able to be considered a firm resource is it's not dispatchable at 8 or 9 p.m. in the summer when CPS still has very high loads. It's also a reason why we have declining peak credit numbers for storage. So the system will likely evolve such that you need longer duration storage if you've got a lot of intermittent capacity in the system. So a 2-hour battery is not as good as a 20-hour battery, and we're trying to reflect that. I think the reason for the scorecard is to give a set of trade-offs and look at a couple of things. The amount of dispatchable capacity and the amount of market exposure is one way of showing that if you have less dispatchable capacity, you're going to be purchasing from the market more often. It's not only a CPS Energy concern, but also the wider ERCOT system. So there are other studies that can get done where you're simulating random weather years, random outages, random wind and solar outputs, and trying to come up with, well, what mix of resources do I need to minimize the number of hours that the system is down or the outage frequency. We're trying to proxy some of that with the extreme weather event. We're trying to proxy some of that with the capacity accreditation factors. All of the portfolios here have been designed to meet minimum reserve margin requirements given those accreditation factors. But I don't think there's a single right answer in the industry right now as to how much you want to be dispatchable. I think we're going to land in a spot where maybe being below 50% is showing some risks. Being above 50% is going to have some other benefits, but the industry or the ERCOT market just doesn't have a specific element. So as the market evolves, we're going to see different ratings for resources. We're going to see different ancillary services. We're going to see different flexible products. And we're trying to capture some of that here, but the specific ratio, I think, is somewhat undefined.
Okay, page 26. Page 26 illustrates projected fluctuations in portfolio reserve margins over time, depending on the decommissioning of generation sources. P2 demonstrates a short-term rise in reserve margin given the commissioning of a new source a few years before subsequent decommissioning. To what degree can CPS coordinate with, among other public utilities in Texas to take advantage of any anticipated short-term rises in their reserve margins? In other words, what do you do with that?
Okay, from an operational standpoint, it's more of maybe a short-term answer. If you have excess that, looks like a fairly decent amount for a short period of time. Then there's also this kind of standard 15% assumption. We would continue to operate similar to the way we do today. We serve our retail load, our native load. If there's some opportunities in the market, we take advantage of that. Now, the last 3 years, our wholesale, that's that wholesale piece, or if there's an advantage there for our customers, we would take advantage of that. Last 3 years, it's averaged about 20% of our output has been on the wholesale market in generation or megawatt hours. So we would continue to optimize that day to day, hour to hour, But I wouldn't see any special adjustment just kind of based on that particular result. Okay, that'll be a sale, but the purchase, we certainly, that market is there that you would, again, part of the optimization is if there's advantages and if if there's some pricing out there that is better than our cost of generation, we would certainly take advantage of that too. And we do that. We tend to be a very competitive generator cost-wise. So purchases tend to be, at least historically, our purchases have tended to be pretty low in the 1-2% range. Sometimes there's market dynamics where we purchase more, and we'll do that if it's an advantage for our customers.
I would tell you, if you just got it today, so you hadn't had a chance to look at it, but look back in the appendix, there's some utilization charts in there that are quite helpful that'll tell you about how each one of the units are being utilized in this year, and that'll give you an idea of what kind of capacity in and out we've got. The next one is back on 16. Okay, the question is, Of course, we've got small nuclear, and then we've got some, does NA mean not applicable, not available, or what does NA mean?
Yeah, not available in the optimization analysis. So P1 was designed to just have new gas resources. And then P5 through P9, based on guidance from the contributor of that portfolio, we did not want to include that as an option. The other portfolios did have it as an option, but not selected.
And it didn't select.
Yeah, and as we look at the slide, it kind of occurred to me that with that prior question on geothermal, the long duration storage, geothermal, hydrogen, nuclear small modular, those are 2030 and beyond. A little further out, again, some uncertainty and risk. And if technologies don't develop, we certainly wouldn't lock in on those. We would assess those as we go. And if the technology isn't advancing, if there's still a significant risk, low adoption rates at that point, we would have to introduce other technologies, other options to serve that capacity. It's a result from the assumptions and modeling, but just keep in mind a little further out, a lot of uncertainty there and fairly small numbers relative to the need.
Let me back up there, John. This chart shows that we're talking about short and long duration storage, but between 2023 and 2030. Is this after 2030? It looks like it's before.
It's through 2030, and we don't have all the detail here. I think there's some other slides that would show, okay, when does geothermal hit the system, or short duration storage? Yes. Yeah, short is throughout that 23 to 30 period, correct. Now, long duration though, Pat, help me on long duration. In 2030 for the long duration storage, you can see the footnote 6 there, selected only in 2030 due to technology available. That assumption about, I believe it was what type of technology was it? Was it a flow battery was assumed there, and today you don't have a commercial one to speak of, but in 7 years, there's definitely a potential for that to develop.
But to answer the person's question, the short duration is definitely in the portfolios because it's there. Okay. No, that's not it. It was over there. The next one is we go to the table. I mean, go to this. If Ann can help us put the questions up from the people, unless I missed something in the house here. Oh, did I not get yours? Okay, well, I'm coming. Okay. I'm going to do my best. If not, you can help me. Yeah, why don't you just clarify? Yeah. We're not that tied up.
I wanted to clarify that the recommendations that the portfolio recommendations that Public Citizen didn't actually include hydrogen. Y'all asked to put those into a couple of the portfolios. I just want to clarify that.
Even green hydrogen.
Even green.
From water, okay. Here's the first one. How will the IRA factor into the planning besides for hydrogen?
Well, I think it goes to the green hydrogen opportunity that is out there. So the IRA was included in all the portfolio modeling here, including the hydrogen production tax credit. So for green hydrogen production, the IRA offers $3 per kilogram of direct tax credit subsidy, essentially. And as I referenced before, that's about the equivalent of $20 or so per million BTU. And just as a comparison point, natural gas is $4, $5, $6 a million BTU right now. So that's been included. As I said before, the actual source of the water, the electrolyzer, the electricity, obviously has to be spec'd out. But from a modeling perspective, that subsidy from the IRA for green hydrogen is what we included.
Criteria and other pollutants. Thanks. Why can't we also include criteria and other pollutants besides CO2? And criteria means things like SOx, NOx, those that are, I guess, getting scrubbed out or not, especially if CPS Energy continues to use natural gas plants.
Yeah, we'll report on that. I think in the Q&A packet, we noted that as well. So it's not part of the main scorecard, but we'll follow up with specific outputs on that. So NOx and SO2 emissions, particularly NOx, as you mentioned, from gas plants are going to be in the analysis here. So we can give an annual report by portfolio on that as well. So that's the plan. It's just not part of the core scorecard. Yeah, number 8 in the Q&A, just for reference.
Okay, and I think these are follow-ons to that. Dee Dee, correct me if I'm wrong. P6 portfolios have the lowest. P7 versus the margin, 3.12 and 3.31. Am I messing it up? Oh, it didn't say the slide. It just says, go ahead and make your comment.
Yeah,
You're
I'm
going to
sorry.
make it better than I can.
The portfolio 6 and 7 had a reserve margin of 13.1, 13.2, compared to what y'all would, what your standard would be of 13.75. I mean, to me, that doesn't seem like a lot, but really what is that impact? Just a slight difference. Y'all like put that big glaring brown box on those that.
No, it's a fair point. I mean, these shadings are designed to kind of draw the eye to the higher and the lower. It's a couple percentage points below some of the other ones. The point I think that it illustrates is that by 2030, including the retirement of additional natural gas resources, it may be difficult to get sufficient capacity in to replace, and there's uncertainty in the amount of storage capacity credit that all those resources can provide. So that, from a relative perspective, is lower than the others. I think there's other metrics where it shows up on the purchases and the dispatchability as well. I don't think that disqualifies the portfolio, but it's just a way to show that, relatively speaking, by 2030, that concept with the retirements and replacement with wind, solar, and storage is likely to have a lower reserve margin or more reserve margin uncertainty than the alternatives.
Pat, you should be able to read these. I shouldn't have to read them. I'm going to let you read them.
All right, please discuss how the future peak demand was determined. I'm especially concerned about underestimating future population growth, underestimating the energy usage of future electric vehicle charging needs. Electric vehicles would ideally be charged in the middle of the night. However, CPS currently has no means of charging residential customers higher demand charges on an hourly basis. Without a way of charging, penalizing individuals for charging EVs during peak evening hours, there is no real means of stopping customers from charging those vehicles when they arrive home in the evening. So I'll maybe start off. John might have some other comments. We've taken the CPS Energy load forecast, which I believe may have been shared back in the May timeframe with the group. It includes expectations for population growth, economic growth, electric vehicle penetration, distributed energy resources like rooftop solar, and nets out an hourly load forecast. So it is granular. It's trying to capture those things like charging behavior. And then in our net zero economy scenario, which we haven't shown the results of yet, but we did the ERCOT analysis, we assume high levels of electrification, including EVs. So that layers on a whole additional amount of load to the system during those hours when we expect charging to occur. The point on time of use charging is an interesting one, and it's probably a little bit more in the rate design category, but I don't know, John, if you've got anything to add.
Okay, that was a very good comment. As Pat said, we've got a granular load forecast. It takes into account electric vehicle adoption. We think we've got reasonable assumptions on that. We are monitoring that very closely because that is a change out there. That's an uncertainty, and there's some risk there. We also have some pilot programs that we can talk more about if there's interest regarding EV charging. The profiles, we have assumed profiles by the hour. There's some assumption of customers that will be incentivized to stay away from peak hours and things like that. It's all in the early stages, but we're aware of it. We know about it, and we're testing it. And anyway, we can talk more about that as from an interest of how far we've gotten at this stage, and more about those assumptions and the details that we have in our load forecast. And stoves. It's the electrification case.
Let me ask the next question here. When speaking of phasing out gas, has consideration been given to the impact and cost for customers that have gas furnaces and stoves? So maybe two elements here. When we talk about phasing out gas in the core analysis here, it's all about electric generation. So we're not talking about phasing out the gas system at large, but potential portfolios here that would have lower gas consumption to generate electricity. So we haven't modeled or contemplated the fact that those portfolios would also require customers to get rid of their appliances. And we do have the electrification scenario where we have an assumption that EVs take off, and there's potential for customers or industry to move from that fuel to electricity in the home. But we're not assuming that that is mandated or part of an overall phase out.
Somebody got my agenda. Let me borrow one. I got great help here. There you go. Let's see what we got to do. Break discussion. Yeah, that's it. Okay. Thank you. Well, we did it. We got through it. Sure there's no more questions or anything while we've got all this folks here. Concerns. Let me just wait, did we get another one here? Still won't be phase out. Still want the phase out. I don't think that Rudy, that's really back to your gas folks. And I don't think us not operating our generation on gas is going to affect our purchasing power for gas in the market. So if you're talking about home heating or cooking, I don't know that there'll be an impact, but I'm going to let the experts answer that.
Okay, we have a very aggressive, active gas procurement program, and that would continue in spite of transitions we make in the generation side away from natural gas. As we go forward, I know I've mentioned to you before that if we installed a gas turbine today and we started phasing out natural gas, we could transition to hydrogen or some other renewable fuel. There's a lot of research being done in that area. that wouldn't impact what we do within our distribution zone for our customers that still use natural gas. If we did that, then we would be looking at a pretty significant increase in our electrical capacity beyond what we're forecasting now. Did that answer your question?
Anne Marie?
Yes. Thank
Okay,
you.
good. Okay, we got another one here. Have these results been shared with the RAC consultants, Burns and McDonald? Yes, I got heads going up and down over there. Yep. Okay. I am giving you back an hour of time. Oh, wait. Yeah. Oh, perfect. Okay, so we're going to have two-hour sessions with Burns and McDonald on November 3rd. Okay? And those will be online sessions. I encourage you to come meet the folks that you're going to be working with and talking to. They're sitting right back there. Hey, hold your hands up. And we really appreciate them being here today. If you have any questions ahead of time, get them to Ann. She'll get them to them. If not, we'll just come on with 2 hours, talk to them, get your questions answered. You don't have to attend both, one, either, or none. It's just for you, okay? Any other questions, concerns, discussions, complaints? Yep, got another regular meeting right back here in November. And then we got 2 in December. But the 2 in December, the first December one on the 6th will be a discussion just between the group. Talk about whatever you want to, however you want to. I have the consultants here. The second one on the 12th, I believe if I got the right dates, that's when we will go through a series of we'll put all the 9 options out. Everybody will vote for their first option. We'll take the top 4, have a roundtable discussion on the top 4. Anybody can say whatever they want to. Vote again, drop the 4th out. We've got to get to 13 votes. Until we get to 13 votes, we'll just keep doing it. Theoretically, we can't even get, when we get down to 2, we've got to get to 13. There's no mathematical way you can divide 23 by 2 and not get something above 13 on one side, I wouldn't think. But it could happen. You could have 10 and 11. So yeah, it could happen, but hopefully we'll get there. Okay? Anything else? Thank y'all very much. We're adjourned. Appreciate it.